Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is May 19th, 2014, and my guest is William Easterly of New York University. His latest book is The Tyranny of Experts, Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor. And that book is the subject of today's conversation. Bill, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks, Russ. Good to be here.
What do you mean by the tyranny of experts?
Well, it's an unintentional tyranny that results when experts think that poverty is a purely technical solution, and they can ignore whether the rights of the poor are respected or not. So in practice, they accept the status quo in which the rights of the poor are not respected. And what the experts wind up doing is sort of being in charge in an unintentional collusion with the autocrats that are the status quo in the poor countries that they are operating. It's the experts and the autocrats that are running development from the top down, and that is neither morally desirable nor does it work.
Now, you talk about the rights of the poor not being respected by experts. Isn't it more than that? Isn't it the behavior of the poor sometimes, just respect generally, that's missing?
Yeah, there is a more fundamental paternalism and condescension towards the poor, this inability to believe that the poor people are really capable of developing themselves. And so development is thought of something that we, the experts, have to do to and for them, because we really don't believe they can do it themselves. So there's this kind of double standard in that when we think about our own history of how we developed, we don't think about it that way. We think we developed ourselves. We think we, as free people, were able to either be problem solvers ourselves or motivate other problem solvers, political and economic, to solve our needs. But we don't think about poverty or development in poor countries that way. We think of it as this paternalistic enterprise that we, the experts, are doing for them.
Isn't the risk of that approach, which I happen to share, as listeners know, that it dissolves us, it gets rid of our moral responsibility or anything we might do to actually help? We just say, well, they have to develop themselves, it's up to them, and therefore we can leave them alone. But that isn't your conclusion, is it? No,
not at all. And I think the fear of that conclusion has kind of distorted the whole development debate, precisely in the direction of the overemphasis of experts and technical solutions and what we in the West, we rich people, can do. It's like the fear of sort of our indifference has driven us way too far in the other direction, in which we have this frankly sort of self-centered, arrogant, conceited view of ourselves as being the key to other people's development, and that's just as bad an evil as the opposite extreme of the evil of indifference and doing nothing.
Now, your book has quite a bit of history of the idea of development. You go back further than I was aware of in that history. One of the issues you talk about is the intellectual differences between Gunnar Myrdal and Hayek. Many of our listeners may not know Gunnar Myrdal. Talk about who he was and the debate between Myrdal and Hayek that never happened.
Yeah, so Myrdal was one of the early development economists. His writings started appearing in the 1950s as the field of development economics was emerging. And there's a sort of natural pairing with Hayek because he and Hayek got the Nobel Prize in the same year, in 1974. And so there was this kind of juxtaposition of here are these two Nobel laureates who had actually wound up writing about pretty much the same issues, about the big picture issues of how societies do or do not successfully develop. but they had never engaged with each other because there was this sort of strange thing that happened that Myrdal was very much a part of. That development economics sort of seceded from the rest of the economics profession and had this kind of new view of economics that was very planning-oriented, very kind of top-down, nation-centric idea of how development happens, which was totally alien to the way development had been happening up to then, at that moment in the 50s. But those were the ideas that were embraced by this sort of unanimous body of development economists who only achieved unanimity by declaring anyone who didn't agree with them not to be a development economist. So Myrdal was a kind of founding member of this large group, and they became kind of the really only voices in the room on development forever after. And Hayek was not considered at all a development economist. His ideas were not considered at all relevant to development. Of course, Hayek had a brilliant exposition of how free societies develop, but that was simply considered not relevant to poor societies by the development economists.
Why do you think that was? Well, besides the fact that everybody likes to keep their club.
Yeah, I think I think it had definitely had something to do with a lot of condescension and paternalism towards poor people that we've already talked about, which is easier to understand if you, like you said, the book goes back much farther than usual in tracing the ideas of what we could call kind of technocratic development done by experts from the top down. And that goes all the way back into pre-revolutionary China in the 20s and 30s when the Rockefeller Foundation was starting to think about promoting development in China. And then it went into British colonial Africa and was really formulated to a degree of sophistication that's very similar to what exists today, already in the late 1930s in British colonial Africa, with even some of the same technical solutions talked about then as they're talked about now. Like, a random example would be a British colonial report in 1938 said, the way to prevent malaria is spray a chemical called pyrethrum on the walls of the houses that kills mosquitoes. A UN report 70 years later, around 2005, said, the way to kill off malaria is spray pyrethrum on the walls of the houses. And so, this emergence of technocratic development had already happened during colonial times, and I think that's kind of an important clue because it kind of shows that technocratic development emerged at a time when nobody could even conceive of poor people having equal rights to rich white people, and could not conceive of poor people being able to help themselves. So this sort of colonialist mentality kind of was, extreme and an overtly racist mentality was when the formative years of technocratic development were. I don't think that automatically discredits any technocratic development idea. That's not fair. But it does give some insight into the long history of a history of sort of paternalism in the way we think about development, and a kind of double standard in which we can't conceive of what happened in rich countries in their successful development as being applicable to the rest of the world and how they develop.
Yeah, I just want to put in a plug for Adam Smith while you're on this subject, because when you read The Wealth of Nations or The Theory of Moral Sentiments, one of the things you're struck by is the dog that doesn't bark. It's that there's very, very little condescension toward poor people or the Irish, say, of which a lot of elites looked down on at the time. He gives everybody the respect to make their own decisions with the information that they have available to them. And it's easy to forget how radical that was in 1759 or 1776.
Yeah. I mean, he was very much the progressive revolutionary at that point. And I think economists have carried on that role. The liberal economists that followed Smith have carried on that role for many years. John Stuart Mill is another one, advocating very radical ideas about personal liberty, the freedom to do whatever you want as long as you don't harm anyone else. And when I was tracing the history of technocratic development in China and Africa, as I just talked about, alongside them were the heirs to Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, who were arguing for very liberal development ideas, a very liberal approach to development that did stress the rights of the individual and the ability of the individual to be very entrepreneurial and problem solving. And there's this long list of forgotten economists that I will join someday soon. Forgotten liberal development economists who.
It's a very honorable club, even though it's small and not noticed much.
Yes. So, there was a guy named John Conliffe, totally forgotten, arguing the case for kind of liberal development in pre-revolutionary China, opposed by Rockefeller Foundation and the U.S. State Department, who wanted to support the dictator Chiang Kai-shek and a very top-down planned approach to development. And then in colonial Africa, there was a South African economist named Herbert Frankel, who had argued all his life for the political and economic rights of Africans. And he was opposed by the whole development establishments in Africa. So, and there's several more. There was even a student of Hayek, who was a Chinese economist who had studied at LSE under Hayek, who had argued very much for the liberal view of Chinese development in China during the war between kind of liberal and authoritarian development that was conclusively won by authoritarian development in China, even before the communists came along. And his name was Yuan Li Wu. He was completely forgotten, completely erased from history. So there's, all these voices, all these attempts to kind of offer this kind of free, liberal alternative as part of, the great battle of ideologies of the 20th century, that this was offered to the rest of the world, to what was called the Third World. But tragically, the voices from the West who were advocating the authoritarian alternative really drowned out the liberal economists.
Well, I appreciate you bringing their names back up. Maybe someone will be kind enough to do that for you in 70 or 100 years, or even me.
Yes.
Now, you suggest that collectivist ideology can affect values and have a persistent effect over time in its effect on growth. And I'm a little bit skeptical of that. I'd like to think it's true, but I wonder how you might possibly know. So make your case for that argument?
Well, I'm just drawing on a lot of the recent academic literature, which there's been a kind of exploding literature on values and culture and economics that looks at very, very long-run trends and data. And the basic idea that emerges from that literature that's relevant to this discussion is that there's this kind of vicious circle between a history of autocracy and collectivist values. And the collectivist values are those in which you sort of make a big distinction between insiders and outsiders, that you see nothing wrong at all with doing horrible things to outsiders or cheating outsiders, but you will behave well within regard to your own kin or ethnic group. And that's so that it's a complete lack of trust and respect for outsiders or strangers, whereas the individualist values, you have much greater trust and respect for strangers, which then opens the door to kind of the equal the respect for every individual to do whatever they want, which is kind of the basis of an individualist liberal society. So, the vicious cycle happens because if you are already in a collectivist society, and again, another big aspect of this is that in the collectivist values, you conform and you punish any dissenters who deviate in either norms or behavior. In either thinking or behavior from the norms. And, that's the kind of behavior that parents will want to teach to their children in an authoritarian society where there's a brutal autocrat who will put any dissidents in jail, where the ethnic and clan elders will be in collusion with the autocrat to punish dissent from their own hierarchical rule, and the only value that everyone stresses is just obedience to to the hierarchy of sort of father, ethnic group, dictator at the top. And that's the kind of behavior that parents teach to their children, because if children don't follow that behavior, they're going to be, have a horrible life, living in jail or socially ostracized or just, having to flee the country or whatever. So that's why autocracy and collectivist values tend to feed on each other.
But does that persist over time?
Yeah, the evidence is that persists for a very long time. And some of the European cultural researchers have shown this by comparing different parts of Europe with each other. I mean, one of the most famous is sort of North versus Southern Italy. Southern Italy had centuries of autocracy. Northern Italy was where sort of limited measure of political freedom sort of emerged among the earliest of any places in Europe and the city-states of Northern Italy. And this is still correlated today with values that you can measure, like how much you trust and respect strangers.
I wonder if causation clearly runs in that one direction, though.
Well, I think the point is that it does run in both directions. That it's and again, because there's either this vicious circle in which a history of autocracy perpetuates kind of collectivist values, which then make more possible. You're more likely to have an authoritarian system if you have collectivist values. And then if you can get out of that vicious circle, then you have a virtuous circle that happened in Northern Italy and then in the Netherlands and then in the UK and then the US, where you get sort of trust and respect and tolerance for others, making possible a degree of individual freedom in which individuals can do what they want, and that forms the basis for a free society with individual rights.
You talk a lot about some very ugly examples from the early and mid-20th century where aid advocates had some, as you mentioned earlier, some pretty ugly attitudes toward the people they were allegedly trying to help. There's some classic, what we call here bootlegger and Baptist examples, where a lot of times what looked like helpful aid was really pushing a different agenda, say of foreign policy or goals. But let's talk about today's world, where the top-down experts are advocating various things. And I want to talk about, in particular, somebody like Bill Gates, whose approach to development is very data-oriented, wants to have goals. And you're not a big fan of that, so why not?
Yeah, well, I mean, Bill Gates is kind of the classic technocrat example. He really thinks of it seems like he can only think in poverty in terms of really specific technical problems that need to be solved by really specific technical fixes. Like malaria is, indoor spraying plus bed nets plus malaria medications if you do get malaria.
Is that wrong? That seems like those all seem like good things.
They are good things, and of course they are this is the technical solution of malaria. That's correct. So it's not the point is not challenging that these are the technical solutions. It's taking a deeper view of, asking questions like, well, if these technical fixes are so easy, why didn't they happen already? Why are the technical knowledge has been there for decades, as I gave you the example of spraying the walls with pyrethrum, having been there for 70 years. And that's true of many of these technical fixes. And so you have to ask why didn't the technical solutions ever stick when they were tried? And that makes you worry that they won't stick again today if you put only your focus on technical fixes and don't worry about what is the broader system in which they are or are not sticking permanently. And I think the fundamental reason is kind of really, Econ 101 and Political Science 101, that you need sort of motivated actors on the ground who do have the motivation to keep supplying the technical fixes. That the absence of technical fixes is a symptom and not the cause of poverty. It's a symptom of poverty. And the fundamental cause is the lack of rights of poor people.
Let's talk about malaria for a minute.
Sure.
Jeff Sachs was on this program a little while back, and he actually criticized you personally for opposing, so he claimed, the Bednet initiatives in Africa to fight malaria, quoting one of your earlier books where you expressed some skepticism as you're expressing it now. So I want to make sure you have a chance to defend yourself. And in particular, won't the people on the ground, don't they want the Bednets? Don't they want their houses sprayed? Why is it, where's the Econ 101 in the Bednet problem that in terms of incentives or knowledge that makes a top-down solution problematic?
Right. So first of all, I mean, I think the people like Jeff Sachs or Bill Gates, they like to characterize me or other skeptics of their ideas as being, like openly in favor of malaria. So I want to make that.
That's correct. And we'll talk about that maybe in a minute. But yeah, that is the implication. Yeah, you want to go on the record you're against it? You want to?
I want to forcefully go on the record that I'm opposed to malaria. I'm opposed to people dying from malaria. I have just as much empathy and caring about this tragedy as they do. It's more about wanting to really find out what works, and where what works is not limited to what works for 5 minutes, but what will work permanently to fix the problem. And so you're asking, what is the Econ 101? Well, so let's be very clear about this. So the solution to malaria involves either a private good or a public good, and probably some combination of both. So, Econ 101 tells us very well how to motivate suppliers of private goods. There's, the market does that, and that's profit. In the long run where we should profit. Where there are private good solutions to poor people's problems, poor people are willing and able to pay for these goods. And if we think that there's some poor people that are so poor that they're being excluded, then probably the best solution would be to subsidize their incomes rather than to directly have the aid experts take over the provision of the private goods. And then I certainly agree that it's not all about markets. It's not all about, there is a role for public goods. There is a role for the state. And I think this is where the most fundamental disagreement comes with the technocrats, is how do you properly motivate the state to supply the public goods? Suppose we did decide that there's major externalities to malaria eradication campaigns, that it's mainly a public good. Let's just take that as a possible hypothesis. Even then, and it's one I'd be very willing to consider. But we still have the problem of motivating the state to provide this public good of a malaria eradication campaign. How do states get motivated? They get motivated when poor people have political rights to hold them accountable, to punish them for failure and reward them for success. We do that in our own societies by, we gave a horrible amount of grief to one poor New Jersey governor who just created a traffic jam on a bridge. That's a way in which we manifest political rights in action, that we keep. We keep politicians from doing bad things to us, and we try to have them divert their energies to doing good things to us by supplying public goods. Democracy, the freedom of speech, freedom to protest, freedom to dissent, freedom of thought, all of these are really vital ingredients in making sure that if it is a public good that is the answer, that the state will be motivated to not do bad things and instead do very good things to make these technical fixes stick. It's like Amartya Sen said very famously a while ago that democracies don't have famines. And that was, one of the big things for which he got the Nobel Prize. And that's been, debated up and down, but I think it's fundamentally correct that there's something about democracy and political, not just, we'll talk more about what democracy means. I'm talking about political rights in general, the ability to protest and freedom of speech that create a sort of early warning system which really motivates states to do the technical fixes that prevent famine or to prevent malaria. And those incentives are really, really absent in authoritarian regimes that rule through repression and terror and coercion. That they have no motivation to do good things for the public, to make the technical fixes for malaria or famine stick, because their fundamental incentive is simply to just stay in power by more coercion and repression. That's the fundamental point here really at stake, that really the technocrats do not get. States are not benevolent on their own. They're only benevolent when we, the citizens, have the political rights to force them to be benevolent. That is the key point.
But stick with Bednets for a second. Are you opposed to the idea of a centralized government, democratic or autocratic, giving away Bednets as a way to fight malaria?
Yeah, I'm very willing to consider that as part of the menu that would fight malaria. You could argue that malaria does have, because it's contagious in an indirect sense, in that the mosquitoes are the vector that spread malaria from some people to other people. So anytime you have an element of contagion, there is an externality that calls for some public intervention. And so maybe kind of mass distribution of Bednets could be justified to deal with that. Free distribution of Bednets could be justified to deal with that externality. But I think that Sachs and Gates really underestimate the way the market can very much contribute to these solutions. I mean, and actually has already in a major way contributed to major health improvements and major improvements in other areas. I mean, take antibiotics or soap as examples that have, these are goods that are usually distributed through, very often distributed through markets in poor countries, and that are bought by poor people in pretty much unregulated markets, and have made major contributions to the progress on child mortality that we've witnessed, thankfully, in the past few decades.
You talk about a reduction in child mortality in Ethiopia as being an example of some of the challenges of using data-driven solutions. Again, it's a little challenging to come out against data-driven solutions. And so what's the alternative? Gut instinct, intuition, your mood this morning. So it's a little bit bold to suggest that data-driven stuff is not a good idea. So what's wrong with celebrating the fall in child mortality in Ethiopia, which seemed to be on the surface to be quite sizable?
Yeah, well, I'm not criticizing the reliance on data to get some sense of what is working and what is not. What I'm criticizing is the use of very short-run improvements to render verdicts it's actually a very sloppy, non-empirical way, in which any sort of short-run improvement observed in child mortality by Bill Gates, he attributes right away to Meles Zenawi, the dictator of Ethiopia that was in power at the time. He's ignoring a lot of direct evidence that Meles Zenawi was not a benevolent dictator. We can talk about that more later. But part of it's ironic that he, in his Wall Street Journal article that came out in 2012, he was kind of celebrating kind of the precision of measurement of data-driven solutions as this magical way in which the solution could be engineered and technocratically fine-tuned to really make it work. Because the national child mortality data that he was talking about are just notoriously awful and unreliable, and you can show that by looking just at alternative estimates of the same number of child mortality in Ethiopia, in which you can get anything from a kind of major increase on track to meet the Millennium Development Goals of a huge reduction in child mortality. And some numbers could actually even imply an increase in child mortality in Ethiopia. That's how imprecise the alternative sources of numbers are. Now, the solution to that is not to give up on data altogether. There's a much better solution, which is simply to rely much more on long-run trends and long-run evidence, and not rely on short-run evidence. because the short-run evidence is just way too noisy to know what's really going on or what's really working or not. And it's just directly contradictory to Bill Gates' fantasy that you could year by year know what's really going on to fine-tune your engineering solution from the top down.
Well, when you're steering the car, you do want to know the GPS to be very accurate. You want to get a measurement every second. So the more often, the better.
Well, the more often you're going to be very badly wrong, because the short run data are just too unreliable. So, what this data are useful for are really to give you more of a much more long run verdict, which system is better, a system based on individual rights or a system based on technocrats and dictators. And there, I think the long-run evidence is very conclusive. The gigantic reductions in child mortality have come mainly in free societies, and not in autocratic societies. They came much earlier and much bigger in free societies than they came in autocratic societies. That's what I think the data is telling you. And so the data is really weighing in on this big debate that Bill Gates is completely ignoring and avoiding about is the autocrat of Ethiopia actually the part of, a big part of the solution to development in Ethiopia, or is he actually part of the problem? And I think the big long-run picture says he's actually part of the problem, not the solution.
Well, we had an episode with Morton Jervin on the unreliability of data often
he has
in the long run and the short run. So, one of my concerns is that in many of these poor countries, data collection, it's not so great in the United States sometimes. So, it's a wealthy country that has lots of resources.
But it's not both the long run and the short run. You can't equate the two, because what the great saving value of the long run is that no matter how big the measurement error is, and it is very big, but if it's just unbiased and just sort of fluctuating up and down, even by a large amount, over the long run, that tends to average out. And so you tend to get a more accurate measure, even with measurement error, when you go to longer and longer run data. And that's one thing this book really insists on repeatedly, is that to really get the right evidence that we need for, what's working in development and what's not, you really need to go very long run and not overreact to kind of short run episodes of improvements in either development or child mortality or whatever. Those are just really not reliable, but the long run is reliable.
Well, let's talk about an issue that we discussed the last time you were on EconTalk, which we're kind of talking about through much of this conversation, but I want to talk about it explicitly with respect to China. A lot of people, I think, misinterpret the data, and by people, I mean everyday people. They say, well, look, China is the greatest success story of the last 25 years in the world. China's doing great. China is an autocracy. It's not a democracy. So autocracy is good for growth, that you're claiming it's not. So meet that head on and talk about it.
Yeah. Well, one reason China could have the potential for such rapid growth is it was such a disaster at the starting point. And so, when you start from a disastrously low point, which itself had, I think, the long-run evidence from other places would suggest that China's very, very low starting point had a lot to do with its long history of unbroken authoritarian rule and violence and warlords and foreign occupation. And I think a much better explanation for the rapid Chinese growth is simply that you started from this kind of brutal, totalitarian, authoritarian starting point of you had this psycho named Mao in power who was, just engaged in savage repression of citizens' everyday liberties, and during the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, which created the Great Famine. And from that low point, you have actually a positive change in both economic and political freedom, even political freedom, even though it's still terribly absent today in China. It is better than it was under Mao. There is much more scope for Chinese citizens to make their own individual choices the personal freedoms are much greater than they were under Mao. And it's very obvious that economic freedom is far greater than it was under Mao. And I think it's that change in freedom or put it negatively, the decrease in autocracy is what explains China's rapid growth. And so it's really sort of a mismatch to attribute what is a change, the rapid growth rate of China to a level thing, which is autocracy. The correct match would be the change in autocracy and the change in development, and that is a correlation that supports the freedom side, because you have a positive change in freedom and you have a very positive change in development in the form of rapid economic growth.
But they still have a very, very top-down society. They have leaders who are building cities everywhere, building infrastructure everywhere, and you get folks like Thomas Friedman, who you mentioned in the book, who bemoan the unpleasant partisanship and messy gridlock of democracy in our constitutional republic. We could just just cut through those annoying constraints. We could fix stuff like they do. What's wrong with that argument?
Yeah, well, this is kind of an awkward moment to be making a strong case for a free society when our Congress and president and everyone seems so dysfunctional. But I think we're putting too much attention in the wrong place on what constitutes a free society. It's not just about the majority vote elections that create elected officials who pass and enforce laws. That's not the only thing going on in a free society. I think the main thing going on, what's important is both what is going on and what's not going on. So, what is going on is that we have this sort of free society in which any problem at the local level will generate a lot of protests, like when we talked about Chris Christie and the bridge as an example, and a lot of pressure to fix that problem in the political system. And our political system is very decentralized and allows that kind of freedom of speech and freedom of protest to fix problems in a decentralized way. And that's how a lot of our infrastructure actually winds up working, so that, our infrastructure is a lot better than that in most authoritarian societies in the world that don't have this kind of pressure to fix the infrastructure. Even though our infrastructure is far from perfect, it's still a lot better than that. And the average of all the authoritarian societies of the world. And of course, that's the right comparison that we should be doing, is compare all free societies to all authoritarian societies, and that would be how you decide the argument, not sort of pick out one favorite anecdote in China of how the Chinese autocrats might have gotten one good project through. And then the other important thing is what's not happening in a free society. You're not putting people in jail. You're not shooting people down in the streets. Whereas that is what is happening in China. And so that is both a terrible moral wrong in itself, that you're putting, like the famous artist Ai Weiwei is being terribly hounded and persecuted, or the blind lawyer who is advocating for protecting women from being forced to have third-term abortions, who was eventually exiled and driven out of China, Cheng Wancheng. Silencing and tormenting people like that is what is happening in China, and that's both morally wrong in itself, and it's also preventing this sort of self-correcting, decentralized problem solving that happens in a free society. And that's the secret of why we in the U.S. are still today at, many, many times the per capita income of China as a whole, which is really what we should be focusing on in the big picture, not just China's recent rapid growth rate or one or two kind of infrastructure projects in China. And for China to continue to progress and reach the kind of same level of development that we are, I really think the evidence suggests they will have to politically liberalize and allow political rights to their citizens.
Well, let me speak in defense of cherry picking. My tongue somewhat in my cheek, but it's an interesting claim I sometimes hear. So if we think about education, the United States has a weird mix of top-down elementary and high schools side by side with private schools. Same thing going on at the university level. In a lot of countries, it's all top-down, all the way down. And a lot of times when I speak in defense of decentralized education or getting the government out of education, people will respond and say, but what about Finland? Finland, they have a great public school system. And I think the implication there, it's actually an international test. The last round, they didn't do so well. They got passed by a bunch of Asian countries. But let's just take this example as sort of emblematic of a general type of argument. I think the argument is, well, sure, top-down doesn't work very well lots of times. But look at Finland. Let's just take what they did, which did work. Okay, sometimes it doesn't work. But let's cherry-pick their good results, and we'll just use their system because we see that it works. What's wrong with that argument?
Right. Well, so first of all,
I did a pretty good job there, actually.
Yeah, you did.
Thank you.
That was a great job. Yes. So, this is not how social science should be done, or not how any kind of empirical research should be done. You don't just cherry pick one example of success that fits your case, and that clinches the argument. We look at all the examples of countries that are following the system that you are said to be in favor of. You compare them to all those that have the opposite system, and that's the right comparison to do a kind of systematic study of whether that system works or not. So, in the case of kind of the idea of the benevolent autocrat, that China has been so influential in kind of reinforcing that, China is so wonderful, they're such a benevolent autocracy. Well, that's really cherry picking, because you want to look at all the autocratic societies that have an equally large number of really big disasters. We have like the Central African Republic that was overseen by a series of autocrats that has now completely collapsed and dissolved into chaotic ethnic violence and civil war, and it's been an economic disaster going backwards to a really extreme level of poverty. So, when we talk about autocrats, we're talking way too much about China and way too little about the Central African Republic, and that's a bias that clearly shows a kind of confirmation bias that we really want to believe in benevolent autocrats. We really want to believe that the autocrat on the scene is just going to kind of take the advice that the tyranny of experts gives them, takes our advice on how to develop their own societies, and so that will so easily solve the problem of development if we, the experts, can just come up with the right expert solutions.
But I think it's more than that. I think it seems to me that it's true. Obviously your point that you need to look across all examples when you're trying to evaluate the general argument is true. But I'm trying to make a subtler argument, which is let's admit the fact that autocracies don't work very well. Let's admit the fact that top-down educational systems often fail. But let's just use the good ones. We've got evidence that Finland's works. So let's just take the features of that one. Of course, most of them are awful. But, trial and error is let's take advantage of the fact there have been a lot of experiments with bad top-down, and we'll take the good ones and adapt them to our system.
Yeah. Well, it's a delusion to think that that we understand well enough what makes the more successful top-down examples work, that they can be applied to around the world. And it's a very similar delusion that happens with China. I mean, which the World Bank President Dr. Jim Kim himself kind of fell for. He on his visit to China, he said, "Oh, this is so wonderful. We should spread the model of China's development success around the world." So, of course, what we're leaving out here is we really don't understand all that well what's making the so-called more successful autocratic examples different from the failed autocratic examples. We understand much better the big picture, which is simply that free societies have a much better outcome than autocratic societies do. That's really the big dominant thing that should be driving most of our opinion on the subject. What's going on as far as within autocracies, that some of them seem to be doing better than others, I think there's a good argument that it may have very little to do with the personality or the individual autocrats themselves, which is the usual argument that you just have good and bad autocrats. There's several reasons to think that. One is that just that poor countries in general are really prone to boom and bust economies that are much more volatile than rich countries. That's a very well-known stylized fact, that poor countries are more volatile, and that means that you get sort of the worst growth rates in poor countries, and you get the best growth rates in poor countries. Some of them will have really great booms in which they're taking advantage of things like technological catching up, and others will have real disasters in which commodity prices are declining and kind of sending into receivership the main export industry of the country. And so poor countries in general are just very volatile. And the poverty is the thing that's driving the volatility. It's explaining the so-called success and failure, the high variance of success and failure. And of course, poverty is also associated with autocracy, because that's why they were poor in the first place. It's because they had autocrats on the scene. And so autocrats will be on the scene while there are very highly variable growth outcomes. But it's simply spurious to attribute the high growth outcomes to the so-called good autocrats who happen to be on the scene, and to put all the blame on the so-called bad autocrats that happen to be on the scene when you get a poor country that's on the negative end of that variance, getting a big bust instead of a big boom. And I've actually confirmed this more systematically with a colleague at NYU. We've done a paper in which we tried to use the timing of the booms and busts to see whether they match the timing of leadership changes, to see whether we can kind of prove or disprove the idea of benevolent and malevolent, good and bad autocrats. And we find very little evidence that it's the individual leaders that explain success and failure. It just seems to be that the changes do not line up in timing. The booms and busts do not line up in the timing with the changes in leadership. So it seems to be just that some autocrats just happen to be in power while there's a boom going on for other reasons, and then we're spuriously giving them credit when they don't deserve it.
So one way to look at that summary is the way I would phrase it is the world's a complicated place. Cause and effect are elusive. And that really pushes you, as you've done in this book, methodologically toward a very big picture. Yeah. Again, sort of the opposite of the Millennium Development Goals, going at some tiny micro piece of the economy, saying, oh, I can just fix that, because a lot of times there's luck, there are other factors. You don't know whether the levers you're pushing and pulling or the turning and adjusting are the ones that are actually making a difference. And it pushes you toward a much broader approach that is unfortunately prone to the other problem we have is that it's true you can't run effective regressions, I think, on minute, tiny parts of economic growth and failure. But when you go to the level you want to go to and generalize about autocracy and freedom, the other side will say, well, you've cherry-picked these examples, you've left out a lot of the history, and you've said that, oh, freedom works better than autocracy. We don't really know that. There's too much going on, and I'm more comfortable, says the alternative view, with looking at these things I can actually measure and statistically.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, let's not forget the role of having a theory about the way the world works, and then we're kind of like having alternative theories that we're testing against each other, and then deciding sort of which theory does the weight of the evidence suggest. That's really how social science or science in general works. You don't, there's no such thing as kind of theory-free empirics that just, where there's the data are able to speak and tell you what the truth is without having some kind of clarity about what you're trying to test by having two alternative theories that give two different predictions. So, if we have kind of two big picture theories of autocracy versus freedom, we have very good theories that we build up over decades and centuries in economics of why free societies work. And I'm not saying that's enough to accept them, but it's enough to take them seriously and take them to see which the relative weight of the evidence is going to support. So, we understand the problem of incentives and the problem of knowledge is solved much more easily by a free society, that when you have kind of decentralized entrepreneurs that have both local knowledge and strong motivation, that they'll be much more motivated to solve problems. We have kind of the political economy version of that both local and federal government officials will have get motivated to get the right knowledge and be politically motivated to do good things when they get sort of political rewards for problem solving, as opposed to autocrats who don't get political rewards for solving the problems of the majority of the population. So that's the sort of theory of freedom. And then you test that against, a large body of historical and modern evidence. And the reality is we do science, and both science and the reality of our daily lives suggests we do have to make choices. It's not, we don't just say, oh, the evidence is rigorous and not rigorous enough, we're going to believe in nothing. People are making choices between autocracy and freedom as their default view of how they think development happens. And they're often doing so in a very sloppy way based on a few anecdotes. I think if you kind of systematically process most of the long-run evidence and the modern experience, the evidence on the side of freedom is far, much stronger than the evidence on the side of autocracy. You just don't have an overwhelming number of autocracies that have been successful development examples in the long run of having attained a high level of development. You don't have a lot of examples of kind of ever-escalating autocracy going together with ever-escalating higher development and education and health and so on. You have the opposite. You have, a lot of free societies that have attained a high level of development, and their history was of an escalating degree of individual rights for the majority of the population and ever-expanding larger circles of the population going together with better health, education, and development.
So as a social scientist, I certainly agree with you, right? And
right.
As an activist, I also agree with you, but you have to be, it seems to me we have to be humble in the following way, and I know you are, so I want to give you a chance to say so. The implication of what you just said is that, so we should be advocating for more economic freedom and better economic policies on the part of the poor nations of the world, less autocracy. And yet, when we look at the so-called Washington Consensus and various types of advice that international organizations have given poor countries, their suggestions to move toward more market-based solutions haven't always panned out successfully. So, one, how do you reconcile that with your story? And two, what's to be done then?
Yeah, well, I think that's a big misconception that if you do decide that freedom is the right approach, either, usually people are only deciding that economic freedom is the best approach, and they have a shameful neglect and disinterest in political freedom. But let's leave that aside for the moment. If you do decide that economic freedom is the best approach, what then does that imply that you do? And I think this is where political freedom does really become very relevant. The great thing about both kinds of freedom is that they are self-correcting systems that punish those who fail to solve problems and reward those who do solve problems. Problems with sort of IMF and World Bank experts kind of parachuting in saying, here's what I think you should do to become a free market society that I think will benefit you, is the experts themselves are not accountable, and they themselves do not have either the opportunity or the motivation to acquire enough local context-specific knowledge to make their solutions work. So, the fundamental problem in successful problem solving is always coming down to the motivation, that is incentives and knowledge. And the problem with the tyranny of experts is that the experts have neither the sufficient motivation through being held accountable for their successes and failures, nor do they have enough local knowledge. And that applies just as much to those experts that are recommending freedom as it does those who are recommending autocracy. So that's a sort of paradox that arises here, is that when you come to acknowledge sort of the power of freedom to be the the successful problem-solving system that will work to achieve development, that sharply reduces the role of kind of the overall guiding, planning expert with a lot of power. Experts within a free society have to be embedded within the system of accountability in either markets or politics, that they will be held accountable if they fail. They will be rewarded if they succeed, which is not what's happening today in the world of development experts.
So I'm sympathetic to that view. It does allow the other side to say that that they have not only good intentions, but they're trying. A lot of people respond to Jeffrey Sachs and Gates by saying, okay, so they may not work so well, but at least they're trying. Whereas you and I, we're not even trying. We're just saying, we don't know what could be done. We don't have the local knowledge. And so our best policy is to stand back. How do you defend yourself against that moral criticism?
Well, I think, first of all, the trying that's going on by Sachs and Gates is part of the problem and not part of the solution, because because of the ideas that they're creating about how development happens. They're creating an idea in which the way that development happens is having these that are Western experts, foreign experts at the center, at the heart of the development solution. It's a profoundly misguided view of how development happens. And I think ideas are just as powerful or more powerful than these kind of direct technical solutions in helping development happen, that economists and others around the world who sort of understand and are convinced of the ideals of freedom can play a really powerful role in education and advocacy and spreading those ideals and supporting those around the world who are fighting for those ideals, for the ideals of freedom. Supporting Ai Weiwei, the dissident artist in China, and his campaign for rights and democracy instead of supporting his oppressor, supporting the jailed dissident blogger Eskinder Nega in Ethiopia, who's been sentenced to 18 years in jail for nothing more than writing peaceful blogs advocating democracy, supporting him instead of supporting his oppressor, which is what Bill Gates and Jeff Sachs are doing by working hand in hand with the authoritarian Ethiopian government and praising them for their successes. I think these ideas and these ideals are very powerful, and people are willing to give their lives for these ideals. This is how powerful they are. So advocating these ideals is itself a huge positive contribution to development, and certainly the much more powerful and the opposite of what Bill Gates and Jeff Sachs are doing, in putting themselves at the center, kind of arrogantly and condescendingly putting themselves at the center of the development problem, of the solution of the development problem of the rest of the world. It's like we really need like a Copernican revolution in development. It's the Gates-Sachs view puts the Western experts at the center, the Western aid efforts at the center of development, and that's just a delusion. Those efforts are paltry, they're ineffective, and they're not how development happens. And they're very condescending towards poor people, and thinking that the main hope of poor people is these Western experts. The Copernican revolution would revolve around not us, not we, but the them that is implied by the we, and we would not even call the them the them. It's them deserve to be we just as much as we do. And when we put we, when we put all of us around the world at the center of development, that we mainly achieve development by advocating for our own political and economic rights with the support of others, friendly supporters around the rest of the world, then that's the correct view about how development will actually happen. And that's much more likely to make development happen if we have that view spread and take flight and flourish around the world, and we support the brave people fighting for that view around the world.
Well, if Jeff Sachs were, I think he'd say, as he did on this program, he's a big friend of markets. He thinks markets are crucial to development. All he's doing is helping create some infrastructure and other things that are going to unleash the bottom-up solutions that are going to grow. Those are things like fighting malaria, building better roads, scientific knowledge, infrastructure such as schools, etc. He thinks of himself as a market kind of guy.
No, that's fine. There's lots of market kind of guys in development. I'm not disputing that. The point is that what he's missing is that all these technical solutions that he's talking about, why are they going to be done? Why are they going to last? They're not going to be done, and they're not going to last in an environment that depends on the unaccountable, unmotivated, unknowledgeable Western experts. They're going to be done, and they're going to last when they're done by locally, homegrown, politically accountable, economically accountable, entrepreneurs and officials who have all the incentives and the knowledge to make them last. And that's what a free society does. And so what Jeff Sachs and Bill Gates and many others like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and just Jim Kim at the World Bank and all the official aid agencies, what they're unintentionally doing is peddling just this fundamentally misguided view of how development happens by putting themselves at the center of development. They censor themselves not to even talk about the issue of freedom for poor people. And thereby they miss the main solution to how development does happen, which is free people asserting their own political and economic rights, which is how all those technical and infrastructure solutions do stick and do get done in the long run. And we have that track record of free societies to show that, and we have the modern examples to show that. And that's where the weight of the evidence lies. And I think that's also, there's also a moral case that these freedoms are good in and of themselves to begin with.
So let me close with a challenging question. Do you think the world would be a better place if tomorrow the World Bank and the IMF closed their doors and just said, we're on the wrong side here for all our good intentions? And I have many friends who work there. I know you do too. They're great people. They mean well. If we close their doors, would the world be a better place?
I would not. That's not where I would go first. Where I'd go first is I'd say, look, you guys, you've really got the Copernican revolution the wrong way around. You're putting yourself at the center of the problem. You're refusing to talk. You're censoring yourself to not be able to talk about the freedom of poor people because you conceive that you can only do your job by praising the autocratic governments that you work with and giving them the credit for development. By doing all that, you're creating a fundamentally misguided and disheartening view for poor people of how development happens. That it can only happen at their expense when they are oppressed by their own rulers. And I think you guys can switch sides. You can switch away from backing the authoritarian side to backing the free side. And I think you guys in the World Bank and other aid agencies are going to have to make that switch to survive. So I would invite you to make that switch rather than calling for your abolition.
My guest today has been William Easterly. His book is The Tyranny of Experts. Bill, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
My pleasure. Thanks, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.